Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The Secret Story of Him, Chapter 13. From the roots, we grow. Deny, defend, depose. For over a year in Mexico, him and the group settled in the abandoned town of Camarón, a place still scarred by the echoes of war and loss. Once a thriving village, it had been left desolate in the wake of political unrest and battles that shaped the turbulent history of Mexico in the 1850s. Him chose Camarón deliberately, not just for its shelter but for its potential. Pacwa and Marcus, bonded by the fires of rebellion and survival, were married in a simple yet powerful ceremony that felt like a triumph over everything that had tried to break them. Ida, fierce and unyielding in her own way, found her match in Eli, a man as steady as the mountains surrounding their new home. Together, they began rebuilding, constructing homes from the broken remnants of the past, creating schools to teach the children the power of knowledge, and working the land to ensure their survival. But for all the progress, he never allowed himself to feel truly free. Freedom, to him, was more than land or distance. It was the liberation of all who still lived under the yoke of chains. Each American newspaper that made its way south fueled his rage. The articles were filled with lies, dismissing the humanity of those he had left behind, turning them into faceless stories of property lost and rebellion quelled. The more he read, the more his anger burned, not just for himself, but for the countless lives still trapped in bondage. He wasn't content to survive. Him was driven, unshakable, relentless. Freedom was not enough. He wanted justice. And justice would demand action. Their lies cut like an over-sharpened blade, slicing deep into the heart of his rage. The paper reeked of smugness, its words dripping with venomous cruelty as it painted the Jones Plantation revolt as justice served. It declared, with a sickening finality, that every last one of the ungrateful savage niggers had been captured and executed. No names were given, no humanity acknowledged, just bodies erased and buried under the weight of their narrative. They dared to call it justice, as if slaughtering men, women, and children who dared to grasp at freedom was anything but barbaric. The report went on to note, almost casually, that Mrs. Bessie had passed away from an illness. Her death was given more dignity in a single sentence than the lives of those who had suffered under her reign. Now our younger son had taken over the Jones Plantation, and with him came the promise of order restored, a return to the vile, unrelenting system that bled life and hope from the enslaved. What they didn't dare admit, though, was the cost of that so-called justice. The countless masters, overseers, slave patrolmen, and bounty hunters who had fallen broken, gutted, crushed at the hands of those same ungrateful savage niggers they called us. The rebellion hadn't gone quietly into the night. It had erupted like wildfire, leaving ash and blood in its wake. Farms had burned, men who had wielded whips were left to rot in ditches, and fear, true, unshakable fear, had gripped every plantation in every single state. That was the truth they buried beneath their lies, because the very thought of it terrified them. They feared the idea that those they called property had risen, fought back, and made them bleed. They feared the reckoning that had come in the dead of night when the enslaved, no longer bowed and broken, had turned the tools of their oppression into weapons of liberation. Axes meant for cutting cane split skulls instead. Chains, once used to bind, became instruments of vengeance. Fires, set by hands once forced to build, consumed the great houses and fields, reducing years of cruelty to smoldering rubble. For every name erased from the paper's lies, there had been a master or overseer who screamed their last breath under the weight of justice delivered by those they thought were too weak to rise. The paper wouldn't dare mention the overseers who ran, their pride stripped away as they begged for mercy that would never come. It wouldn't write about the bounty hunters who tracked the rebels into the swamps, only to vanish into the murky depths, their bodies swallowed by the very land they thought would protect them. It certainly wouldn't speak of the fear that still lingered in the South, where whispers of the Jones Plantation rebellion were spreading like an infection, sparking unrest in kitchens, fields, and slave quarters miles away. They wanted to write the revolt off as a failure, a fluke, a brief moment of chaos snuffed out by their righteous hands. But he knew better. He could see the cracks forming in their empire, the fear hiding behind their bravado. Every lie in that paper only fueled his resolve. They hadn't broken the rebellion. They had merely delayed the inevitable. As Him sat in that small Mexican town, the words of the paper trembling in his hands, he vowed that they would bleed again. They all would. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. In the wake of the so-called short, 16-month-long fight for freedom, the reaction to Him's rebellion was nothing short of a blood-soaked campaign of terror. The papers called it order restored, but the truth was far more grotesque. Fueled by vengeance and the dread of losing their grip on power, the oppressors unleashed a reign of terror across the land, slaughtering hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children each month. Their bloodlust knew no boundaries. From cotton fields to sugar plantations, bodies piled like warnings left to rot in the open, swinging from trees like grim trophies, or buried in nameless mass graves. Our broken bodies became symbols, twisted reminders that freedom came with a price they intended to make unbearable. The air itself reeked of death. Roads once used for trade and travel were now lined with silent threats, bloated corpses, shattered skulls, the rusted clang of empty shackles swaying in the wind. Chains that once bound wrists and ankles now coiled around throats, choking the life from anyone who dared to rise. This was not justice. It was fear masquerading as order, a savage ritual meant to break the spirit before it could rise. It was a message, a declaration of war, and Him read it loud and clear. Each word he read only sharpened his anger, carving it into something cold and unrelenting. His people were being hunted like animals, their cries muffled under the weight of a world determined to crush them. But Him could hear them. He could feel their pain in his bones, their suffering coursing through his blood like fire. And as he stared at the paper in his hands, his mind was made up. He would return to America, not as a man content with the gift of freedom, but as a weapon forged in rage and sacrifice. He would give up his life, his peace, his sanctuary, if that's what it took to bring justice to those who deny God's truth, that all men and women are created equal and are born to live free. Him would become the storm that tore through the South, uprooting the very foundations of the evil that dared to call itself civilization. For every body they left hanging, there would be retribution. For every life stolen, there would be reckoning. Him would not stop until the chains were shattered, the plantations burned, and the screams of the oppressors echoed louder than the cries of the enslaved. If freedom was a gift, then justice would be his sacrifice. He would not rest until the earth was soaked with the blood of those who defied the will of God and dared to enslave God's people. In 1859, the southern United States was a land scarred by greed, brutality, and the suffocating grip of slavery. Cotton was king, its white fibers soaked in the blood of the enslaved who labored in the fields. The southern economy, almost entirely dependent on slave labor, was a beast that devoured human lives to feed its insatiable hunger. Plantations sprawled across the land in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, their fields vast empires of suffering where every ounce of profit came at the expense of human dignity. In this world, an enslaved person was worth $1,000, about the average cost of a small car today, an amount that could be considered fortune in a land where human life was reduced to property, valued only for what it could produce. The political tensions between the North and South were reaching a boiling point. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 had ignited a firestorm, with the Supreme Court ruling that enslaved people were no more than property, their rights non-existent. The Southern elite, drenched in the sweat and blood of their slaves, clung to their peculiar institution as though it were sacred, while the North's cries for abolition grew louder. This was a time when every conversation seemed to end in violence, every disagreement a potential spark for war. Then King John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October 1859. Though it failed, the raid reverberated through the South like a thunderclap, a grim reminder that the North would not rest until slavery was destroyed. The South, already gripped by fear, now faced the terrifying possibility that the rebellions they had long denied were real and that there were men like Brown willing to die for them. It was in the aftermath of this that him, reading the papers in his small Mexican haven, saw the writing on the wall. The land he had left behind was a war zone, every city and plantation a powder keg ready to explode. The numbers were staggering. Over 3.9 million enslaved African Americans were scattered throughout the South, each one a potential spark in a growing inferno. The strict codes that controlled their every movement, the unyielding force of the overseers, the nightmarish punishments all designed to break their spirits only pushed the enslaved toward resistance. The Underground Railroad thrived, its hidden pathways leading those brave enough to risk everything for freedom. But the more him read, the more he saw the truth that raged in his chest. This wasn't just about him, or about those who had fought beside him. This was about a people, a race, a nation that had been crushed underfoot for far too long. And so, as the southern United States sat perched on the edge of war, him made his decision. He would return to America, not as a man seeking refuge, but as a force of nature relentless, driven, and unshakable. He had seen enough of the lies they told about his people, the lives they erased, the bodies they hung. The Southern economy may have relied on cotton, but it also thrived on the backs of people who had nothing but their lives to give. Him would return, and he would take that life back. The world would remember the names of those they tried to bury, and he would ensure that justice was served. He would sacrifice everything, his peace, his freedom, even his life, if it meant tearing down the empire of suffering that had been built on the backs of the enslaved. And when the South bled, when the plantations burned, when every lie they told crumbled to dust, him would be the one who had ignited the flame. Him stood before Patwa and Ida, the two women who had become like older sisters to him, their bond forged in blood and fire. Their faces were etched with disbelief, their eyes heavy with the weight of his words. He told them his plan, his decision to return to America and continue the fight. Ida clutched his arm, her voice trembling with anger and sorrow, begging him to reconsider. Patwa's sharp-tongued, usually unyielding, faltered as she tried to talk sense into him. But him's resolve was unshakable. He promised them he'd return not for himself, but with more of their people freed from chains. He swore it like an oath, and they knew better than to doubt his word. Ida, tears burning in her eyes, turned her grief into action. She took the bullet-stopping vest they had pieced together from scraps of iron and leather, working tirelessly to repair its broken plates. She mended the camouflage suit, stitching it with the precision of someone who understood that every thread could mean the difference between life and death. Patwa and Marcus, unwilling to waste time on sorrow, bartered with the locals for maps of America. They treated anything they could spare, tools, labor, even their own handmade goods, to arm him with the knowledge he'd need to navigate enemy territory. The days leading to his departure were tense, filled with an unspoken understanding that this might be the last time they saw him alive. Patwa tried to mask her pain with gruff practicality, handing him the maps with a curt nod, her lips pressed tight. Ida, on the other hand, hugged him fiercely, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Don't you dare die out there." Hume didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was already set, his body already moving. And so, with the rising sun casting its light over the small town of Camarón, Hume began his march back to America. His heart was a storm, raging with anger and purpose, each step a beat in the drum of war. Behind him, the only family he had left stood watching, their silent prayers following him like shadows. Ahead of him lay the land that had tried to break him, a land soaked in the blood of his people. But Hume wasn't returning to beg for freedom. He was returning to take it. With each mile, his determination grew sharper, his rage heavier. By the time he crossed the border, he was no longer just a man. He was vengeance. He was justice. And the South would soon learn what it meant to fear the unbreakable. As him slipped silently across the Rio Grande into Texas, the air grew heavy with the stench of death, thick and suffocating like a shroud. The land itself felt cursed, poisoned by the rot of injustice. Every step he took brought him face to face with the grim harvest of the southern hatred, trees twisted into gallows, their branches straining under the weight of bodies. The bodies of his people, men, women, children, their faces frozen in agony, their cries silenced but still screaming in the wind. Each tree became a sacred altar of grief and rage, and him refused to look away. He stopped at every one, bowing his head, whispering into the darkness, "Good morning, my brother. Good morning, my sister. Good morning, child." The words were quiet but fierce, like a prayer forged in fire. With each whisper, he poured his soul into them, his voice trembling with sorrow and fury. It was more than a farewell, it was a ritual, a funeral hymn for the dead stolen from the world too soon. The rhythm of his whispers carried the weight of 1,000 ancestors, a prayer rising to the heavens and digging into the earth, calling forth their strength. It was a piece of Mother Africa, an echo of tribal funerals long past, and in it he found power. With each step, the whispers fueled him, the ancestors empowering him as he empowered them. The weight of the dead did not crush him, it sharpened him, strengthened him. And in that moment, clear as the sun rising on the horizon, he heard her voice, Mama Kalisa. It was as though she walked beside him, her presence unshakable, her words a command. "Rise, sunrise, rise." The sound of her voice was like a spear through his chest, piercing every doubt, every fear, until nothing was left but the fire burning in his soul. She wasn't just speaking to him, she was summoning him, transforming him into the embodiment of their shared rage, their unyielding spirit. Him clenched his fists, his breath steady as the weight of her words filled him. "Rise, sunrise, rise." And so he rose. With every prayer, every step, every whispered farewell, he carried the strength of the dead, the will of his ancestors, and the fire of his mother. The South would know his name. They would feel the fury of the people they tried to erase. They would taste the ash of their sins, and their screams would echo through the trees where his brothers and sisters once hung. Him had returned not as a man, but as the reckoning they thought would never come. You've been listening to the secret story of him, from enslaved to the grave, the man who freed more slaves than Harriet Tubman. Chapter 13, From the Roots We Grow, Deny, Defend, Depose. Thank you for walking with us through this chapter of sacred rage, where the soil of exile gave birth to purpose, and grief became the fire that sharpened justice. If this chapter struck something in your spirit, honor it, like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop your truth in the comments. Every word matters. Every voice rises. Chapter 14 is rising. Tap the link. Follow him back into the mouth of the beast. Support the mission. Cash App gives $Mayatine. This ain't just a story. It's the storm that memory made. The roots remembered. The fire returned. The promise of freedom now weaponized.